Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome to another episode of Resurrection Podcast. And I'm your host, Daoud, with you again. And with me, we have a special guest and a really interesting topic. And the topic that we're going to discuss today loosely is Islam an anti-Black religion? Is Islam an anti-Black religion? And to explore this discussion with me is associate professor at the University of California, Irvine, and actually a travel companion of mine. We spent some time together in West Africa and Senegal. We'd like to welcome to this episode of Resurrection our brother, Dr. Rasul Miller. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How you doing, Sidi?
I'm doing well. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well. Can you see me okay? Is the lighting a little funny? It's sunset time, just about.
Here I can see you just fine. I can see you just fine.
Cool. Alhamdulillah.
Praise be to God. Praise be to Allah. So I know that before we go into this topic, I know that there's a brother that we both knew that passed away recently. So I know that you want to lift his name up in the discussion before we began. So it's yours.
For sure. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to do that. So yeah, I just wanted to mention this past week we had a big loss in our community. Brother by the name of Haj Muhammad Dooley Abdul Salam. He comes from, his father is a pioneer of the Muslim community in New York. One of the founders of the Muslim Islamic Brotherhood, was one of the leaders of the Muslim Islamic Brotherhood, the assistant imam there, and just a pioneer also of building the relationship between Muslim communities here in the U.S. and Muslim communities in Senegal. Imam Saeed Abdul Salam, may God be pleased with him. But the son, Brother Dooley, he just passed away this past week. It was a beautiful brother, man. He was actually the first person, I think the first or second person I met when I went to Senegal the first time in 2006. And, just real beautiful spirit. He was always feeding people. He was a master on the grill, and he loved to, feed people. And he was always fly, had a beautiful sense of humor, so our community is really grieving. Just wanted to mention his name so that people can pray for him. I know there's some different fundraising options out there too for people who want to, help and contribute something, to his family. But the way he passed actually was the way that we're taught in our tradition. When people pass in that way, they're counted as martyrs. He passed away defending himself, defending his property, but unfortunately he was really tragically killed, in a robbery. And I just wanted to mention his name. We're praying for him. It's even hard for me saying it. He's a young man too. He's only 42, and he's very much missed. But at the same time, we are thankful that we can remember his life and legacy as being so beautiful. And even his ending, as tragic as it was, as I said, we know that people who go out in that way are counted among those that God is most pleased with. So we're praying for him, praying for his family. And I just wanted to mention that before we jump into it.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you who want to donate to that, I know one of those is on launchgood.com, and you can go and check that out. And there's a fundraiser on there. But mention the brother in your prayers, please. But beyond that, give a few dollars. When you have a situation where you have a head of a household in particular that gets lost, that gets their life taken due to violence in particular, but when you have the head of the household that gets taken out, that's a really traumatic situation. It's not just emotionally, but even as far as financial. So please do what you can and support that on Launch Good. So
if I could just say briefly, if you go on my Facebook page, I know I have both campaigns there. So that's one easy way. People can just go on my Facebook page and find the links to give. But it's floating around there other places too. So hopefully people are familiar with it.
Okay. So wonderful. So we're going to dive into this discussion. And I know that some people may be wondering, how can this even be a question is Islam an anti-Black religion? But there's a number of different factors while people in the Black community in America in general um, have taken this understanding or believe that Islam is an anti-Black religion. And I think that there's also some differing, generationally speaking, even. So it's regional, it's generational, and it also has to do, I believe, there are factors ironically, from Western academia and European sources that played a factor uh, into this understanding. I think number one. I think number two also, the not underestimating the effects of the propaganda machine of the media uh, after 9/11 and the collective effect that that has on people. Then we also have unfortunately, in many urban areas, the poor conduct and business practices of many Muslims who set up shop in the hood from the so-called Middle East. So there's a number of factors of how this issue is brought up into a question in a lot of Black folks' minds, and to the point that even a number of them don't even ask it as a question, but they declaratively say that Islam is an anti-Black religion, similarly to how they would say that Christianity is anti-Black, meaning that there are some folks who say that Black folks traded in the religion of the white slave master, which is Christianity, for the Arab or the Arab slave master, which is Islam. So that's kind of where we're beginning at for those who are perhaps asking themselves that question, or wondering where this discussion is coming from, and why we are centering it, and in particular as it relates to African Americans.
Right, right. No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. I think you hit it on the head. I wrote a piece some time ago for a website called Sapelo Square, talking about this issue. And one of the things that I tried to do is I started from this question of, where did this idea that Islam is an anti-Black religion start? Because as you alluded to, if you go back to the late 1960s, for instance, you find that, Islam is a thriving part of, the Black community and Black cultural circles. It's seen as a very positive force, a sort of pro-Black force, of anything, whether it's in, folks in the Black arts movement who are Muslim or influenced by Islam, folks in the Black Panther Party and different Black nationalist organizations on the East Coast. If you go back a couple decades before that, Muslims are a huge part of the jazz scene. So much so that if you look at the number of jazz artists, prominent jazz artists that are Muslim, it's staggering. And if you look at those sort of influenced by Islam, or those who had band members and friends that were Muslims, you'd be hard pressed to find a major name who's not touched by Islam positively. Even if you go back to the 1920s, knowledge, and 30s, knowledge of Islam is not as prominent in the community as it is now. But among leaders and intellectuals, Islam is seen as a sort of positive force on the African continent, an important part of Black history, by as divergent voices as Marcus Garvey, who actually chairs a meeting to decide whether or not his movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, would actually embrace Islam as its official religion, and ultimately decides not to just, embrace a sort of pro-Black approach to any religion. But Islam is very much sort of embraced by Garvey as a part of the family, so to speak. And W.B. Du Bois, right, who's a frequent, debater, a critic, him and Garvey are critics of each other. But if you look at Du Bois' 1915 work, The Negro, he talks about how important Islam is in the context of African history in North and West Africa. So I wanted to know, where did this idea come from? And the sort of argument that I put forth is exactly as you said. One of the sources for this idea it does come from sort of Western academia. And you mentioned language. It's not really until recently that we have as many scholars who are trained in history and Africana studies and whatnot who who are doing West African history and Atlantic world history, who have the language competency to go in and dig into, all of the West African language sources written in Arabic script, as well as Arabic language sources from West Africa. But, really you have in the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s, you have the emergence of a certain kind of voice within academic circles. And I think the best example of this, and maybe one of the earliest examples of this, is a guy named Bernard Lewis. Right? And Bernard Lewis is a prominent historian, who has a relationship with the British government, has a relationship with the Israeli nation state, right? He has a particular kind of political agenda. He famously has a debate series with Edward Said, who rightly criticizes him for his Orientalism. But his response to Edward Said is, well, at least I'm upfront about my political sort of positionality as a person who's writing in the service of empire. So Bernard Lewis writes a book called Race and Color in Islam. And in the initial version of this book called Race and Color in Islam, he actually tells you in the introduction that, he's writing the book in part because he's frustrated because Malcolm X, among others, has promoted this idea that Islam is somehow better for Black folks and sort of better on the race issue than Christianity. And that kind of just upsets him, right? So he decides to write this book to try to cast this negative light on Islam and how Muslim communities around the world and historically have dealt with the issue of race. He eventually repackages the book as Race and Slavery in Islam, takes that out of the introduction, and this becomes a widely cited work. I mean, if you look at, we the other day had a conversation about the work, I'm blanking on the name, by Bruce Hall, A History of Race in Muslim West Africa, I believe is the name of it. If you look at in the beginning, when he sort of starts his journey to talk about anti-Blackness and racism in the Muslim world, who does he cite? He cites Bernard Lewis. If you look at, a scholar like Richard Turner, who I really enjoy his work, Islam and African American Experience, when he's looking for someone to cite to discuss sort of race and the history of the Muslim world, he cites Bernard Lewis, right? So it's not even just folks that we may have a political problem with. This work just becomes, just proliferates and is widely cited, widely influential, and it's stemming from a person who has a political agenda where he tells you in the early version of the book that he's really frustrated at Islam as being a force in this sort of Black solidarity movement globally, this idea that people would connect to Islam in that way. Another important example, particularly in what we might call the Afrocentric community, is Chancellor Williams, right? Who writes a very influential book called Destruction of Black Civilization. And, I feel him, in trying to write a book that casts a light on the different ways that Black people have been victimized and oppressed. But he writes this book without a lot of footnotes, right? And he says all of these things about Islam and slavery in the Muslim world, right? And most people who read this book and were influenced by this book in the 1970s and beyond that don't realize that he was a staunch Christian, right? And that's not to say that a Christian can't do good historical work and be fair and balanced, but he certainly doesn't write a book where he sort of cast equal attention on, people from different groups who are anti-Black. He deals with the history of Islam in Africa in a particularly negative way, right? And since then, we've had a host of scholars who've come and done work to kind of balance out the record, so we know that his account is not really accurate. And one more person I'll mention. In this, I have to thank our brother Sidi Bilal Ware for pointing me to an article by a scholar named Anne McDougall, where she talks about the history of abolition and how white European abolitionists, part of what they would do when they wanted to talk about slavery as something that was not suitable for them to engage in, they would say, well, slavery is something that, Arabs and Muslims engage in, right? This is also against the backdrop of white people being enslaved in North Africa, right? And so they built this rhetoric of slavery as something that these big bad Muslims and Arabs and Africans are doing to us, and so it's not suitable for us to engage in. And in so doing, they tried to create a false equivalence. They tried to make slavery in Africa and in the Muslim world the same as slavery, transatlantic slavery that they were engaged in. But in this article, she also discusses the work of John Hunwick. who I won't put in the same category as, Chancellor Williams or Bernard Lewis, but he's a scholar who, has a robust body of literature that has been very influential for students of African history. But in this article, she does a good job of pointing out how John Hunwick, in some of his work, he makes this jump, right, where he says, well, he's looking at the trans-Saharan slave trade, slavery in North Africa, and he says, well, this probably is similar to slavery to transatlantic slavery. And he sort of starts from this presupposition that people of discernible Southern Saharan African descent, quote unquote, Black people in the Mediterranean world must similarly be a product of a dispersed African population through slavery, right? Similar to populations of Black people in the West. And we know from a lot of other scholarship that that's simply not the case, right? But so from these different ideas of these scholars that starts to proliferate, you get the advancing of this equation, or this notion that Islam and Muslims have functioned vis-a-vis slavery in Africa and among Black people, similar to the way that Western European Christian powers have. And that's simply not the case. We find that in the case where you did have Arab or Arabized North African Muslims who were engaged in slave raiding, who were trying to engage in some kind of colonial project in West Africa, they never did it in the name of Islam. They did it in the name of wealth and pillaging and thievery. And they did it to communities that were already Muslim, right? So when we look at how Islam comes to West Africa, it doesn't come to West Africa through slavery, doesn't come to West or even Central Africa through slavery or through any kind of Arab occupation or anything like that. It's spread through these indigenous African lineages of Muslim clerics who go around serving the community, endearing Islam to the people, and Islam sort of spreads like that. And then later, you have communities of Arab or Arabized North Africans who say, yeah, we're all Muslim and everything, but we don't care about that. We're trying to come up and do what we can to enrich ourselves. So,
right. Well, you touched on a number of things right there, Habib, and a couple of things I want to lift up. And you mentioned Chancellor Williams. I mean, we can put Bernard Lewis to the side as a white man in a sense, who had a very Eurocentric Zionist sort of like neo-colonial agenda in his Orientalist critique of Islam. When we talk about someone like Chancellor Williams, who is well, who's revered in certain circles within the Black community, and especially from certain generations, and also I'd throw in there John Henry Clark as well. I throw him in. I think there's a couple of mistakes that these and let's put Chancellor Williams' potential, or not even potential. Let's put his Christian-centric bias to the side, relating to a level of anti-Muslim animus that he has. Okay, there's two problems with the Afrocentric discourse, and one of them I'm going to touch on specifically that you mentioned is, well, actually you touched on two, and I have to crystallize them and see if you can make further comments. The first is no matter how well-meaning these men were, they're reading about and studies about Africa in general, and also Muslims in the African continent, is limited to the language and the sources of Europeans. Mm-hmm. In other words, their primary resources aren't touching on original textual material, right? And especially if we're talking about Islam in West Africa, one cannot even consider themselves a real thorough scholar without knowing the Arabic script. Why? Because number one, much of the history was written in Arabic, but even when we talk about the Malian civilization and other countries that wrote certain texts for their history or their civilizations, even when they're writing in their native tribal tongues, they're using the Arabic script to write, because those individuals in West Africa who spoke languages of West Africa who were literate, they were writing using the Arabic script, right? So I mean, this is one thing. The second thing is this, ironically, it's this European reductionism, where as a response to European colonialism, they then they use certain false Pan-African language in response to European colonialist discourse, thus trying to shrink Africa and African history as somehow it's this homogenous continent. So then the discussion of Islam in East Africa or the Swahili coast, that history or certain circumstances there is transposed as something universal on the entire continent, where the expression of Islam from madhab to certain cultural influences is much more Arabized in the Swahili coast and in Zanzibar and these areas. If you're going to compare it to Wolof speakers, Serer speakers, Mandinka speakers, Senegal, Gambia area, if we're talking about Bambara in Mali, if we're talking about the Hausa and Fulani people in what we know now as northern Nigeria, it's very different historically. So I think this is just two problems. One, an issue of language competency, of being able to access sources in non-European languages. And I also find it interesting how these people will not believe what these European sources say or question them when it comes to people who are Black in sub-Saharan Africa. But when it comes to Muslims or even to Arabs or Amazighi people or so-called Berbers, then somehow they believe that. Right. So it's a very interesting frame of mind that many of these brothers and sisters that delve into, be they of the Chancellor Williams type or those who are in the Hotep or some other things that hold this level of anti-Muslim animus.
Right. And I think that's a great point that you make, because even if you look at one of the first African languages that began to be available for people to study here in America, in North America, was Swahili, right? So there's a way in which, there was a sort of, we have to understand that one of the driving engines of our Black intellectual tradition in America, right, in the U.S., and I limit it to that just because that's what I know, right? One of the driving engines was this desire to sort of reconnect with a historical Africa, right? And that project has moved forward over the course of the last couple of centuries, as people have gotten more access to travel, more access to language. So if all you know is the sort of Indian Ocean world history of Islam in Africa, then that's a different history that is characterized by a higher degree of enslavement, a higher degree of Arabization. However, if we put a microscope under that history, we see that many of the people that are engaged in enslaving, many of the slavers who are imagined, if we want to sort of superimpose our Atlantic world experience on the Indian Ocean world, imagined to be these big bad Arab anti-African slavers, right? They're Marcus Garvey's complexion. Right? Because race looks totally different in the Indian Ocean world, right? It's not about what is the color of your skin. I was in Qatar once, some months ago, and I saw brothers, who were Khaliji, who were. What I mean by that is they were clearly of the indigenous. They were respected as a part of the indigenous governing class of society in in that part of the Gulf, in that part of the Arab world, and they were dark skinned. They had hair like you and I, so so even that doesn't quite compute, or isn't a clean sort of analogy. But yes, we do have to be honest that there's a different kind of history of Islam in the Indian Ocean world. Slavery and Arabization and colonization function very differently there, right? But in the Atlantic world and in West Africa and Central Africa, where most of our ancestors as people who are descendants of folks who were enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade. That's simply not the history, right? That's simply not the history. And in fact, we find that Islam has functioned as an engine of anti-colonial sentiment and armed resistance against colonial forces on the African continent, and armed self-defense for us here in North America in the 20th century, and an engine of connectivity. I mentioned our brother Dooley, may Allah be pleased with him, have mercy on him, early at the beginning of the show. This was a brother who also studied in Senegal, right, from the time of as a young boy, right, was fluent in Wolof, right, studied Islam in West Africa, and his parents were African American. His father's family is from Orangeburg, South Carolina, where I grew up, right. So Islam has even facilitated a degree of transatlantic connectivity between Africa and Africans in the Americas that I think in many ways is unprecedented, right? It goes beyond, and I'm not downplaying the importance of this, but it goes beyond what we might call heritage tourism or folks trying to find their roots, but actually, folks living on the continent, intermarrying, learning the languages, right? So Islam has played, I think, an important role in facilitating a kind of African consciousness and Black internationalist consciousness. And quite frankly, one of the reasons why I think some of the folks, and again, this is not a dig, because I think there's a lot of value in it, especially if we put it in historical context. But one of the limitations of, I guess, what we might call Afrocentrism as a sort of intellectual movement at a particular time that really emerges in the 1970s and 1980s is that folks just don't have the same kind of access to language and travel. They have more than they did in the 1940s and the 1950s, but now we have even more, right? And so I think it's important for people who are invested in this project of understanding and, for lack of a better word, reclaiming African history, that we grow and we evolve, right? And that as we learn more, we have a concept of pro-Blackness that's capacious enough, that's big enough to be able to accommodate for this new information.
Yes. And another thing too, I want to lift up is, and you alluded to this as well, but we also had to make a distinction, I think, between Islam and Muslims. Mm-hmm. Like they're not the same thing. So Islam is a faith, is a faith in which there are different theological interpretations within that one faith, or we would say Islam. And then there are Muslims who have varying levels of adherence, and like all civilizations, there are good and bad. There are ebbs and flows. Similarly to Christianity amongst Constantine and the Romans look very different from the Ethiopic church, the Abyssinian church in Ethiopia and Eritrea, or look different than how Christianity was practiced by Coptics, or the Copts in what we would say is Egypt. So I think that's also another issue where sometimes there's this universalizing Muslims and tying one particular aspect of Islamic history or certain Muslims as truly representing Islam. And I'll just give one example about how some Afrocentrics will say that, well, Black folks are following when we follow Islam, we follow the religion of Arabs. So firstly, there's a misunderstanding of what Islam means to Black people, or Muslims in general, I should say, which is the religion or the way of life of all prophets, including Idris or Enoch, who lived in ancient Kemet, right? So that's one thing. We believe that God sent prophets to all different nations of people and communicated with them in their language, in their languages, right? So this is one particular aspect where Islam was completed under an Arab prophet, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but that Islam is a continuum of all of the prophets and saints that have walked this earth. So that's the first thing I think some people misunderstand when we talk about Islam.
That's
And
right.
then I would also say the second thing is that historically speaking, when the early Muslim community following Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was persecuting the city of Mecca, and two groups of them migrated to Abyssinia, which we would now know as Eritrea, Ethiopia, and part of modern-day Sudan, in which they were given refuge. And ironically speaking, Islam began to establish itself, and people began accepting Islam in Africa before it even spread to Medina or throughout the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. So the irony of this discussion that even how Islam is practiced under Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it established itself in Africa before it fully established itself throughout the Arabian Peninsula going into Greater Syria. So since Islam has been practiced in the Horn of Africa longer than it's been practiced in Iraq, or longer it's been practiced than in Syria, then how can those people say that Islam is not an African religion?
No, absolutely. And I think some of the, it's interesting because I did say, okay, we're, things are evolving, we're learning more. But sometimes when I go back and read people like Edward Wilmot Blyden or W.B. Du Bois or Marcus Garvey or Deuce Muhammad Ali, there's some things they had figured out that it seems like we've kind of forgotten. One being, this idea that we can separate the Arabian Peninsula, right? And not to mention Egypt from North Africa. Like there's some invisible barrier between Africa and Egypt and what we've come to term the Middle East, right? To where the two have no interaction. Where do we get that idea from, right?
The Middle East is a European British construct.
Right.
It's not even real.
It's not even real. And when you go back into the history, you find that there's a very long relationship between people in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and Saudi Arabia, Arabia Felix, the Arabian Peninsula, whatever you want to call it, right? Because it wasn't always Saudi Arabia, right? Arabia goes back further than the House of Saud who governs it today. But there's a relationship such that, depending on what kind of historical narrative you're reading, maybe the folks in East Africa come from, what is today Yemen. Maybe the folks in Yemen come from what is today East Africa. The founders in the chronicles that relay the founding and the history of the dynasties in Mali and Songhai, in those oral traditions, they say that some of those folks actually migrated from Yemen, and we could discuss whether or not that's reliable or not reliable, but clearly there's a relationship between what people are calling the Arab world and Africa today, such that, even when we go back and read these sources.
Well, even Arabic language is called an Afro-Semitic language.
That's right.
And Arabic has roots coming from Ge'ez, which is ancient Ethiopian.
Right. That's right. And sometimes you'll even hear it referred to as an Afro-Asiatic language, right? So maybe Elijah Muhammad and Noble Drew Ali were onto something with that, with that part. But the way we look, and I do think it's important to have these conversations with compassion, right? Because when I encounter folks who have this, idea that Islam is somehow anti-Black, there are people who just have an agenda, right? And it becomes very clear when you start to see what examples they want to cherry pick. I mean, even if you look at somebody like Bernard Lewis, for all the things I said about him earlier, he's not a dummy. He's brilliant, right? He's so brilliant that he can come and say, well, this is what we can get from the Arabic language, and this is what we can get from Arabic poetry. And before you know it, you start to forget that, now we're not talking about Islam anymore. And we're definitely not talking about Islam in West Africa. We're talking about poetry, right? So when we go back and look at this history, it's important that we learn how to separate the anti-Blackness of our modern world from the epistemologies and the worldviews and the views on race that people had thousands of years ago, right? So when people come across these accounts where, you look at a tradition from the Muslim faith that says the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, said, follow the people in charge, even if they be a Ethiopian with a head like a raisin, right? And it's imagined to be this pejorative thing. Or he says, look after the blacks, right? But is that what he meant, right? There are people who, and I mentioned our brother Bilal Ware earlier, he talks about this in his work. There are people who've come back later and said, well, that's not really what this means. Like this, when it doesn't mean look after the black people in a paternalistic sense, it means follow the black people. Once you actually look at the Arabic, right? Or when he says, follow an Ethiopian.
Take the blacks, like take knowledge,
right,
and take
right,
the state of being.
Exactly. So there's a whole universe. I mean, there's traditions, there's accounts that describe the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, as white, right? And so people take this and say, well, this means he was a white Western European man, right? But you go into the Arabic, you find that, white and brown and red and black, and these terms don't mean anything like what we use them to mean now. Because there's also traditions that said the Prophet Muhammad's grandfather had 10 sons who were black as night, right? And if any of the readers are familiar with your work, then they know very well that you can't make these sort of, 1,000-year jumps where you take what we understand to be race, what we understand to be white and black and whatnot, and superimpose it on people back then, because there are plenty. And you kind of see it even when you travel to the Arab world a little bit today, where, you or I would be considered, in certain areas, like we could look like indigenous folks, right? And people who would be considered in America black, right? I think there's a very strong argument to be made that, even the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him. Now, I haven't seen him, so I'm not saying anything about what he looked like. But people have made the argument that if you look at the way his complexion is described in the Arabic sources, right, that if he were alive in America today, you would consider him a black person, right? And that's not a crazy statement to make, right? Now, I'm not saying that he would be, he wouldn't be. I almost think that's beside the point. But the point is the way we understand race and the way we understand, sort of ethnic and color distinctions is a product of transatlantic slavery, is a product of Western European colonization, even the association of blackness with slavery, right? If you look at even the word slave, right, we know it comes from the word Slav, and it's an indication that Eastern European people at one time were the favorite. It was the favorite source of slaves in certain parts of the world for a long time. If you look at the work of Ibn Battuta, his travel logs, the North African explorer, when he goes to West Africa, he describes encountering an African ruler who owns white Turkish slaves, right? I mentioned earlier in North Africa, right? You have white people being enslaved by, people in North Africa. So slavery is kind of just a fact of life in the pre-modern world, but anybody can get it, so to speak, right? It's not until much later in the 18th and 19th centuries, very late, when white Western imperial powers have enough power to outlaw the enslavement of white people and make the enslavement of black people, make enslavement something that is only suitable for black people, that now that has reverberations all around the world. Yeah. So we can't just presume that, folks, and then that trickles down into the way things are translated, the way Muslims, the way Arab, South Asian, and maybe even African-American Muslims today interpret their text. Because we're all products of a world where white is on top and black is on the bottom. But that's not the way the world looked 1,000 years ago. Right.
And I think that, and just touching on a couple of points you said, I think one is problematic when we transpose modern or postmodern conceptions of race and put those on the world 14 centuries ago. Like, that's problematic to use these contemporary racial constructs. Two, and this goes back to going back to the original sources to actually understand and read Islamic history. This goes for Muslims as well, who care around some of these misunderstandings about what it means to be an Arab. And they can be even Arabs themselves who don't even know their own history, right? Like how there's a miseducation of the Negro, but there's a miseducation of the Arab too,
That's
right?
right.
So, for instance, it is clearly written in all early sources that predominantly Arabs were described as being brown and dark brown skin color and predominantly with kinky hair, right? And these are the original Arabs from Yemen, in which there's a close historical link between Ethiopia and Yemen. Number one, this is undisputable, right? How Arabs got lighter is like how we got lighter as African Americans. Right?
That's right.
It's intermingling with other sorts of women, where when the original Arabs went to places for trade, or when Islam spread, they began to consort with other women. But interestingly, the Arabs' favorite concubines were actually Turkish, Armenian, and Persian women. And that's how Arabs over time and century got lighter, just as we as Black folks in the West got lighter when our mothers were taken advantage of by the British and the French slave masters, right? Hence, we got lighter. But going back to what you said about even how in Arab countries today, how the construct of race is different, I'll just tell you a quick story. So my spiritual mentor, he's from the Hausa tribe. So he was born in Ghana, in Accra, but his family migrated from Kano, from northern Nigeria, to Accra, which the majority of those Muslims in Accra actually are Hausa Fulani who migrated from the states of Niger and Nigeria. So I was with him, and I've traveled with him to Africa, but we were on one particular occasion, we were with this in front of this scholar from Tunisia. So the Tunisian didn't know where I was from when he met me, right? So he was trying to guess in Arabic where I'm from. So he asked me, "Are you Egyptian?" I said, "No." He said, "Are you Sudanese?" I said, "No." This conversation's in Arabic.
Right.
I said, "No." He said, "Well, where are you from?" I said, back in Arabic, "I'm a Black American." Now I'm with my spiritual mentor, Sheikh Ali, who's Hausa, who is literally about as dark as this, right? So I said, "I'm Black." He looked at me and started laughing. And he said, "You're not Black." And he pointed at Sheikh Ali and said, "He's Black."
That's right.
Black.
That's right.
He said, like you're like light brown. You're not Black. He's Black. So in his conception, in his mind, I mean, yeah, I'm an African American, but over in Tunisia, and how people from Tunisia look at people, to him, I look Arab. I don't look like a West African, right? So that's kind of like how different people view things. And so we have to be also careful of even transposing the context of how race is viewed in Western societies, in America in particular, and just assume that in other countries in the world, we're talking about Tanzania, or if we're talking about Oman, or if we're talking about Tunisia, that the rest of the world is operating based upon these constructs that are European, that were imposed upon us here in the United States of America.
That's right. That's right. And just to try to make it crystal clear, what I said before, even these different terms that are used to mark, like, it gets nuanced, and you know this, better than I, but the terms that get translated as white, okay, well, this term means a wheatish complexion that's light brown, whereas this other form of white that's associated with people from Western Europe it's a different word, but it's the same, it means like pale white, right? And then you have red, right? Some people are referred to as red, right? Some people, when you go down to East Africa, referred to as green, right? So it's a totally different epistemology. And I think, honestly, when, as African American folks, when we get to travel to these places, I think, even the anecdote you just shared, it just opens up a whole new reality. When your traveling is limited to the traveling that you can do through the books that you read, right? There's only but so much you're going to be able to sort of step outside of your, sort of way of seeing the world and all these constructs that play in your society, right? But once you start to go other places, you start to see that, well, this stuff doesn't hold up. And I actually think that this is one of the things that that's really beautiful about our tradition of Islam in America, because Islam has facilitated more working class Black people who are not in the military, right, to travel than anything that I know of. I'm sure, just like me, brothers who from the hood, who don't have a lot of money, who, have gone, spent time in the Middle East, right? Gone, spent time in the Gulf, and come back refreshed, because they're like, they didn't treat me like a Negro, right? Maybe they didn't see me as one of their own. Maybe they did. Maybe they thought I've had that experience of traveling to places. Oh, you're from here, right? No, I'm not. And people from other parts of the world don't know our history. They don't know their history, and they don't know our history. So, as you mentioned earlier, one of the things that I think has eroded a lot of the goodwill that Islam has had among Black people for a long time is the presence of folks coming from other parts of the world and not engaging Black people in a respectful, positive, even decent way, right? And I'm not taking anybody off the hook for that, right, at all. But what I have come to realize over time is that these people don't know our history, right? People are sold a dream that in America, it's a meritocracy. And if you do the right things, you'll succeed. And anybody who doesn't succeed is because they didn't do the right thing. And then they come to America and see, even some of our West African brothers and sisters have told me this. They come to America and the State Department tells them, stay away from the Black community. Black people ain't no good, right? And then they come here and they're like, oh, I see the people who don't have no money are Black, homeless people Black, people getting locked up are Black. But then if they stay a while, 10 years, 20 years, they have children here, then they often start to wake up and realize, wow, I'm not able to reach this American dream either. And some of these brothers and sisters that I was told to be scared of, they're the people who will actually give their lives for me, will actually look out for me, actually show me and my religion some respect because of the history Islam has among Black people, right? And then, sometimes they'll become repentant, right? And they'll say, man, but we've all been duped by the same enemy. It's all white supremacy.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I want to touch on something else linguistically before moving on, because you mentioned something. So for those of you who may pick up old texts or read things about Islamic history, there's some things that we have to get straight about how color is described that Habib Rasul touched upon.
I opened up a can of worms.
well, firstly, from a linguistic perspective, and then also how these terms are understood from a spiritual perspective, because we have the physical and the metaphysical, and how Arabs would use terms that have symbolic meaning, just as we would use terms that have some symbolic meaning or having certain idiom within the English language or any language. So, number one, just to touch on, when the Arabs talked about someone having white skin in particular, this meant the color of wheat. It didn't mean pasty white.
Right.
When they talked about people from the Roman Empire or Persians who had white skin, they used a term which mean red. So they would say the reds, ahmar in Arabic, right? So this is one thing to clear up. But when the Arab says such and such has a white face, this doesn't mean skin color. There's two meanings. One, that they have a face that's free of blemishes. But number two, is not just the blemish of, let's say, scars on the face or certain marks on the face as far as complexion, but that their countenance was free of blemishes, meaning their character. So they would say someone has, and also that word can also be used as light or illuminated. So the one with the white face means the one with the illuminated character, right? So these are common mistakes that people who make, who don't know or haven't studied classical Arabic. Similarly, how there's different uses of the word black, right? So black can be used in one of its nominative forms as meaning something negative, but then black also relate to the word power in Arabic, or how the word leader or master, mastery, a sayyid, one who's mastered something, it related to the word sud, which means black. So in Arabic, blackness also means mastery, right? So it's so, but these are things that if people haven't understood Arabic and they pick up and they read something that was translated um, or written by Bernard Lewis, right? We use them, or anyone else like this. You'll come across with a false reading that can lead people to false conclusions.
Right, because Bernard Lewis isn't going to tell you that blackness is associated with mastery, but he is going to tell you all the bad stuff, right?
He's not going to tell you that. And quiet as kept, the average Arab who only knows colloquial Arabic doesn't even know that carries that meaning in their own language, just as many of us who grew up here in the United States of America, if we were to go back and read something in Shakespearean English, we might have a problem, depending on our level of education, right?
Yeah.
So it's a similar thing. So I want to transition into
real quick before you transition. I'm really, really glad you brought up that point, because one of the things that I notice is that a lot of folks now sort of start from this premise that anti-blackness is primordial, right? That there's always been, this anti-black impulse, right? And so when people start to sort of look into, and I've had this experience with young scholars and young students. So then when they start to get a whiff of this Bernard Lewisian type of, historiography, it's like, well, all of this is the same as in English, right? All of this negative stuff is associated with blackness. But we find in our tradition, it's a mixed bag, right? And by our tradition, I don't mean Islam, which is really our tradition, but in this Arabic language tradition and in an older sort of tradition of understanding ethnic difference from the quote unquote Muslim world, you find there are ways in which blackness is associated with good, ways in which it's associated with bad, ways in which whiteness is associated with good stuff, ways in which it's associated with bad stuff. So we can't presume that the world has always been anti-black. In fact, to presume that the world has always been anti-black is an anti-black, position. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
and also, and even in the term of the usage black, and just to crystallize this point, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not use the term blacks in condescending. As a matter of fact, he used the term and called people black. And he said that the black has no virtue over the white, nor does the white have virtue over the black. And then he also mentioned some other sayings, Khairu Sudan Thalatha, and the best of the blacks are three. And then he listed three particular black people. So the Prophet referred to people as black, and he used it in a virtuous, positive sense or goodness. And black people themselves in that time period that were back in the days of old did not discuss or mention themselves as being black as having a negative stigma. So sometimes even some of our people don't like for us to be called, we don't even like to be called black. And I remember my dad telling me this back in the day, where he said that if someone called, because he grew up in the west side of Detroit, down the street from Mosque Number 1. Back in the day, if someone called someone an SOB, that's an insult. but they call them a black SOB. That's fighting words. Why? Because
Right.
they have internalized that feeling of blackness being inferior, that being called a black SOB is worse than being called a SOB.
Right.
Right. So there's a lot of things that even we as black people, we have to work through with even the negative
Right.
the negative stigmas that we've internalized from living in this society that was established upon anti-blackness and putting blackness down. That we have to be careful and even work on resisting this disposition.
We get
But
passionate about that stuff. We're like, no, I'm black, I'm a Moor, I'm Hebrew, I'm African, and there's truth to all of that, right?
yeah,
But that doesn't mean that I have to subscribe to that in order to have a positive self-concept. I can call myself black and think black is a good thing,
that's right. That's right. And having your own natural hair being a good thing too.
That's right. That's right.
And have your own natural hair. And to my brothers and sisters who may be listening to this or watching this, God created your skin beautiful. Like God created all the different flowers, and they all have their beauty and their own different scent, be they tulips or red roses or flowers that are yellow. So there's no need, especially for sisters, to use that skin bleach cream. And I'm one of the things I was glad about when I was in Ghana a little over a year ago is that I was glad to find out that the Ghanaian government had made skin bleach cream illegal. You cannot sell skin bleach cream. They need to do it in Senegal. They need to do it in Nigeria and Gambia. So be grateful the way that God made you. You don't need to look like the European. God made all skin colors, and He made them all with their own beauty. So there's no need in getting straight hair weave and dyeing your skin to look chalky. So I just had to say that. I just had to say that.
I understand.
It bothered me, Habib, when my first time going to Mali and spending time in Mali, and I saw some of the sisters there that were like looking like chalky and they were bleached, and it really made me it really made me sad. It really made me sad.
Yeah, it's I mean, it feels laughable to even, it's unfortunate to even have to say it, right? But it's bad for the health. It doesn't look good. It's like nothing, no value in it. It's only a manifestation of being taught to hate ourselves, right? It's all of it. So yeah.
The same goes for any of you watching who might be South Asian. That Fair and Lovely cream, stop using that stuff. That stuff
Throw
is
it out. Throw it in the garbage.
In Bangladesh and India and Pakistan, throw that stuff in the garbage. It's toxic. It's toxic. So as we wrap up, I really want to spend this last period of time just focusing on here, because there's a particular history of Islam here in America in the public imagination, but in particular amongst African Americans. And when we look at what Dr. Sherman Jackson calls proto-Islamic movements, such as the Moorish Science Temple, the Nation of Islam, and how the Nation of Islam grew, the Nation of Gods and Earths, or what people would call the 5 percenters. But even before then, we had people like Duce Muhammad Ali, who came to Detroit, who was a protege of Marcus Garvey, who was half Sudanese and half Egyptian, that was teaching Islam here in my city, in Detroit. People back in those days within the Black community had an idea that Blackness was an authentic, that being Muslim or being Moor was an authentic expression of Blackness, that wasn't something foreign. And it was seen as something revolutionary and out of the box. And hence so many people who were part of the Black Panther Party left neo-Marxist thought, secular thought, and became Muslims. I mean, many of them, right, left that and actually became Muslims. But for some reason, in many circles of Black society today, and I would especially say it's even more acute with millennials and Gen Z, and my anecdotal observation, how being Muslim is not viewed with the term I'll use is, there's not the level of Islamophilia, right, for Black folks. I mean, for Black folks who are Muslims or Muslims in general, as it was for, like, when I was in high school, it was cool being Muslim, because the rappers were dropping some Islamic nomenclature in the rhymes, or they were talking about Mecca. We had like Pete Rock and CL Smooth, Mecca and the Soul Brothers. We had PRT, Poor Righteous Teachers, Rock This Funky Joint. Rakim. Even Queen Latifah wasn't a Muslim, but used an Arabic name, as amongst Muslims. Like that whole 90s vibe, it was a different vibe. I mean, the Malcolm X movie popped off in the early 90s with Spike Lee. It was a whole different vibe. And now when I watch some of these Black conscious shows, the same level of respect, like for instance, for instance, I keep my ear to the street. Like, I'm not out in the streets of Detroit as much as previously because of COVID. But like, for instance, I watch Signet or TV.
I do too.
just to see, how they're building, how they're talking. Like Signet, every once in a while, I'll listen to Dr. Umar when he's not pontificating too much. So I'll listen to some of these people just to see how they're talking, and that same. But some of the younger people that come on, especially Sinetta, but some of these other people that talk, I'm not saying Sinetta's not young, but some of the younger people that come on those types of platforms don't have the same level of respect for the Muslims or for them in general. So, and I'm talking about for us as Black folks. I'm not talking about other folks. So what do you think are the causes for that from your information?
Right. Well, of course, people like it when you can be reflective and talk bad about your own folk. I think sometimes we're too quick to talk bad about our own folk. But I'll start by saying some of it is like, as you mentioned, Muslims from other parts of the world who are themselves indoctrinated with an anti-Black, worldview, the way they interact with our people. Some of it is African American Muslims. There's a whole lot of different iterations of Islam, and they're ideological. I guess I'm saying this more so for the sake of conversation. It's funny saying stuff to you because it's like, you've literally written a book on some of this, right? But there's ideological, differences and discussions amongst Muslims. There was a time when the average African American Muslim embraced an approach to Islam that was very interested in social justice and social engagement, or even if you want to call it social activism. They're iterations of Islam that are, you and I both have African spiritual mentors and spiritual teachers who are unapologetically Muslim, unapologetically West African, and absolutely see no contradiction between the two and come from 1,000-year lineage of that. And then there's orientations to Islam that are more conservative, that are more that are less comfortable with people challenging the nation state, and that's important, right? That are less comfortable with pushing people to challenge the nation state, right? There are iterations of Islam that are more sort of Arab centric, right? And so as Islam has become such a force among African American people, Black American people, people of African descent in the West, people are plugging in to iterations of Islam that are less affirming of Black people and our Black struggle and Black radicalism, right? So that's a part of it, right? But I think another part of it that I don't hear people talk about very often, that I think is very important, when I watch, Side-Netted TV, and when I watch these different debates, it becomes very clear to me that there are folks who have a vendetta against Islam per se, right? And some of these folks, they have a vendetta against an Islam that's more internationalist and global, right? Like ours, if I can put it that way, right? Even if it's still a sort of Black affirming, pro-Black orientation to Islam, it's global, right? It's an Islam that'll take you to Senegal, that'll take you to Yemen, right? But then there's also a beef folks have with the nation. And quite frankly, I think it's because the nation has been successful. So the nation has been successful in building a political economic apparatus, right? And a movement, and both Orthodox or Sunni Islam or Sunni and Shia Islam and the nation, both have been, I think, far more successful in reaching the masses of the people, are far more popular, are taken far more seriously, right? Among the masses of the people. How many books are there about Sunni Muslims? How many books are there about the Nation of Islam? How many books are there about the Moorish Science Temple? How many books are there about, I don't want to be disrespectful to anybody, but some of these other, camps and iterations and orientations, so I think that's a part of it. I think some of it is quite frankly a kind of jealousy. People look at how many people have roots in the nation who now, have just a vendetta against the nation. And when you start to unpack the arguments that these folks make, you see that they're not very strong arguments. They're not intellectually coherent. It's more just, well, I'm Blacker. I'm more authentically African, more authentically Black, based on, something in their head, right? So that's one thing. Another aspect of it, though, is I think there's a very real, agenda that's forwarded by folks in law enforcement, that's forwarded by the state, that's forwarded by agents of the state in academia to keep us disunified, right? So I think on some level, I talked to my dad who, goes back like your dad, right? And, when I talk to elders, they discuss how there were these moments where different camps of Black radical folks, different Black religious traditions, whether it was the Hebrews, the Muslims, the nation, had different kinds of engagement with one another, right? And in that same era of COINTELPRO, you start to see different kinds of beefs between different organizations, right? You begin to see beefs over resources. You begin to see,
like Ron Karinga's group with the Panthers, right, in California.
Right. And it's complicated. It's complicated. Sometimes you can have two well-meaning groups, right, that are being manipulated. So I think all of that plays into it. But I think the one of the things that contributes to that problem that I think we can actually do something about is people lack real sound knowledge of history, right? Real sound knowledge of history. If you kind of dabble and somebody comes before you and puts forward this argument and you don't have the tools, it's like back in the day when Dr. York was like kind of a big deal in some of our communities, right? I noticed people who didn't really have any grounding or weren't really entrenched in learning about some of these histories, they would hear this sort of hodgepodge that sort of alludes to this, alludes to that, and they could be swayed by it, right? But if they knew any one of those traditions that he was alluding to really, really well, they could, that's not true about Islam, or that's not true about Christianity, or that's not true about Egyptology, right? So I think part of the issue is that, because we're not reading enough, right? Because we're not reading enough, we're a lot more gullible. And that's not an academic thing. That's not a class thing. Because one of the things, like you mentioned, how a lot of the folks who were in the Panthers kind of left a neo-Marxist ideology and became Muslim. But actually, what I found is that you had a contingent of folks who really, really knew Marx to the point that they could say, okay, this is what we're going to take from Marx. But that anti-religion stuff, and some of the other stuff in Marx, that's not for us. That's not a part of our African tradition.
Kwame Ture was one of them.
Say again?
Kwame Ture was one of those people.
Absolutely. And there were a lot of people like that. A person who I take a lot of sort of inspiration from is a brother by the name of Dr. Muhammad Ahmed, who was the founder of a group called RAM. I like reading his stuff because when you read his stuff, it's very clear that him and people like Kwame, there's a whole contingent of them, and a lot of the folks who were in the Panther Party, in particular on the East Coast, in places like New York and Philadelphia, even if you go back to the 60s, a lot of them were Muslim. Why is the Shakur name so prominent among so many Black radical organizers who were part of the Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army? Some of them were Muslim, some of them were, as you would say, Islamophilic, right? These folks knew Marx through and through. They also knew African history. They also knew African American history. And some of them also knew Islam. And when you have that kind of, well-rounded knowledge, then you can have an orientation where you can sort of take the best and leave the rest. Like you mentioned Kwame Ture, one of the quotes I love about Kwame Ture, he's talking about socialism and Marxism, right? And he basically describes that, what we're referring to as socialism, and he doesn't say that reading Marx and reading that isn't useful, but he says what we're defining as socialism, it's older than this white man named Karl Marx, right? So he started to become interested in things like African communalism and whatnot. If you go to some of the Muslim villages in West Africa today, you see something it's not capitalism. It has elements that may remind you of something that's more socialistic, right? But I say all that to say, before I don't go on too much of a tangent, but I say all that to say, I think part of the problem is when we have a heightened sensitivity, and that's not a bad thing, a heightened sensitivity to anti-Blackness, right? We have to match that heightened sensitivity to anti-Blackness with a real serious passion to learn why the world looks the way it does today, right? And to organize with like-minded people to make it look different, right? Once we kind of just get stuck in the silo of we just want to hear really, really angry people who make us feel more good about how angry we are, but we're not doing anything in the world, that's when I think we start to fall into these problematic spaces where it becomes just who's the best debater. How can I argue that every other group of Black people organizing to do something for Black people is wrong and mine is right? And to me, this is just really, it undermines any effort to do something to empower Black folk, quite frankly.
Right. And I think that's also, before I touch on something, I think that's one of the challenges for us as Black folks, including some of us who have read a little bit, maybe got a degree or two. We talk about decolonizing our minds. That also includes decolonizing our epistemologies, meaning how we view what is truth and how we approach knowledge, because sometimes some of us can get educated and we talk about decolonization, but we still start our history from a certain place, starting from an ideological trend that has its roots coming from someone who's still white, right? And then it's a secular power-based analysis from a physical that's stripped from the metaphysical. And there's nothing African about that, be it from traditional faith practices of the Dogon and Burkina Faso to Muslims in Senegal, Gambia area. There's nothing African about that, and I think that's a challenge even about how we even investigate even the premise of how we judge what is truth. That's right. I think this is something. Now, going back to what you said, it's true that there's a level that our people have been blocked from certain knowledge and been given misinformation. I mentioned Dr. Cara G. Woodson's book earlier, The Miseducation of the Negro. So we have that. We have issues of, frankly, of jealousy, of untamed egos. But I also want to highlight and then tell a quick story and get your comment on this, is that we cannot underestimate outside influences and forces who want to keep Black folks divided.
That's right.
And we have the counterintelligence program, as you mentioned. where they had people in academia that were working for J. Edgar Hoover, FBI, CIA.
That's right. That's right.
Baynard Rustin, for instance, was a CIA operative,
That's
right?
deep.
He was in
That's
the
deep.
movie, right? And then this came out. He was a CIA. Oh, and by the way, Gloria Steinem, she's not black, but she used to work for the CIA too. And
right.
But you know, so that's the leader of your feminist movement. She was working for the Fed as CIA informant. Just throw that out there for you. But some of y'all who may look up to her, but they infiltrated media and had people write fake stories, but they also had informants in the community who act as agent provocateurs to stir up trouble, to get people beefing, so that they're so busy bickering amongst themselves about petty stuff, they forgot the common objectives that everyone was trying to get at. And so I would say to people that COINTELPRO, or the counterintelligence program, doesn't exist under the same name, but we cannot underestimate that those types of tactics are still used in the Black community today, and we have to be careful that we don't get sucked in to this petty bickering and stuff. Now, when it comes to Muslims, and I want to say this in particular, that my mentor told me that he heard this from Dr. Khalid Al-Mansour. He's an author. Some of you may know he wrote a book called Laws Without Justice, amongst other books. African American Muslim. Matter of fact, I need to look him up and see where he's at. I like to get him on the show. But Dr. Khalid Al-Mansour, he told my mentor this, that during the Carter administration, when the Iranian Revolution took place, and some of you can go back and look at this, even there's YouTube videos, Imam Khomeini, he released, when he came from France into Tehran after the University of Tehran students took people in the US embassy hostage because they were saying that these people were spying, right, and working on behalf of the Shah. Khomeini ordered two groups of people free. He told the students, free two groups of people. He said, free all the women, because we don't take women as captives in Islam. The second is, he said, free all the Black people.
Right.
And he said that we don't have a problem with Black people. Black people's problem is back home in America with the white man.
That's right.
The great Satan, which is the language Elijah Muhammad used, and also Noble Drew Ali used similar language because they call the white man the devil.
Well, if I can interject, it's deep. It's deep. You mentioned the great Satan, but then also I've heard an iteration of that story where folks said that what and I haven't gone back to do the research to see what's the exact quote. Maybe it's multiple quotes, but people also said that Imam Khomeini said, "How can I hold a man who does not know himself?" Right? Yeah. So you don't have knowledge yourself, so you don't even know why you're over here. So you're good.
Exactly. Exactly. So he let the Black people free. And the Carter administration was shook by this. We have to look at the time frames to 79. This is just after the Black Power movement had died out. And by Khomeini doing that, the Carter White House, this is what Dr. Khalid Mansour said, was scared that the revolutionary spirit of the Iranian Revolution would infect Black people, and then that they would embrace this particular strand of revolutionary Islam, and it would spread through the streets of America. So to counteract this is what Dr. Khalid said. We will know historically too. This is when, beginning with the Carter administration and following to the Reagan administration, this is when they allowed for the Saudi government and Saudi endowments to fund mosques in America, to fund Islamic schools, and to give scholarships to people, including Black folk. And I know, and you and I both know a couple of them. I know a few of them actually at that time period, and took them to Saudi Arabia to learn a particular type of apolitical, quietist
Right.
Islam that basically had no discussion about blackness in any
Right.
sort of way,
Right.
and then also flooded
And
our
don't go against the state.
yeah, state and flooded our community with certain type of literature.
Yeah.
And this was done specifically with the blessing and by the plan of the Carter administration. So if we want to look at how some people in the Muslim community who are black who were perhaps influenced a way of dealing with black issues and start taking on a foreign vibe.
Right.
According, even if Dr. Khalid didn't say this, that this was something that was engineered by the Carter administration, we can see in the historical timeline
Oh
of
yeah.
when certain institutions and certain things start getting funded in America, it took place right after this issue because won't know the Saudis weren't funding nothing when Imam Jamil, may Allah free him, was given dawah in the 70s, right?
Right.
When people were first coming out of the Nation of Islam and found Imam Wafdi Muhammad, may Allah's mercy be upon his soul,
And
75 and 76, and when Dr. Naim Akbar was still following Imam Muhammad, and then he started and he wrote I got that book right here, matter of fact, the community itself, right? Won't no Saudi influence and all that Saudi stuff was coming
right.
Amongst us. That was something that was engineered by the American government to try to throw us off our square.
Right. Well, and you know what I would even add to that. Yeah. I'm sorry, but
go ahead. Bismillah.
I would even add to that, there have been attempts by the Saudi Arabian government to get entrenched into African American Islam for a long time. And there had been attempts by the state to use that. And this is stuff that I'm actually learning now, going back to doing research on Muslim communities in the 40s and the 50s, that there was this attempt to get Muslims away from some of the more radical Black internationalist stuff, away from this sort of, this idea, this approach to Islam that enabled Black radical folks to take from, quite frankly, Marxism and communism, an analysis of power, an analysis of capital, without all the sort of with all the materialistic, sort of philosophical materialism and anti-religiosity and without all of that, but sort of take the good from it as an organizing principle. There's been an attempt by the American government to sort of stop that. And, it's been building for a long time, but I think our elders were a lot more savvy.
Yes.
And knew how to sort of, if you go back to some of our, and I'll mention some names, people like Sheikh Dawood, people like Sheikh Hisham Jabber, right? Yeah. Even Malcolm confuses people, man, because Malcolm only had about 9 months after leaving the nation, after breaking from the nation, whether you say he was kicked out or, it was a mix of all of that. After breaking from the nation, he didn't have a whole year to really put together his program. So, and he was a master propagandist. So when he started writing the autobiography of Malcolm X, along with Alex Haley, who had his own integrationist agenda, right, who ultimately was able to put his hands on the autobiography after Malcolm died.
Whose roommate was also an FBI informant, who himself was an officer previously in the U.S. military. But go ahead,
right? Just like just like John Ali, the number 2 man.
John Ali.
Like Malcolm's bodyguard, but so there's that. But Malcolm in the beginning sets out writing his autobiography, and it's really a promo piece for the Nation of Islam. So there's parts of it where that comes through. Then you see he leaves the nation and it becomes a promo piece for something different, right? And people sort of read the autobiography and they read some of Malcolm's statements and hear some of Malcolm's statements after leaving the nation. They think that he was a promoter of some sort of, colorblind, Gulf, Arab sort of centric Islam, right? But Malcolm was building a relationship with Saudi Arabian government, building a relationship with, representatives of the Egyptian government and Azhar University, building a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, who both of those governments saw as like a sworn enemy, right? And building relationships with, Muslims in Nigeria, Muslims in West Africa, our brother Akil Fahad, who I know you know very well, he was the first person to share with me that in Malcolm's program for his mosque that he was building in Harlem, right, the Muslim Mosque Inc., he wanted the brothers and sisters to learn Arabic and to learn Hausa. Right? So, Malcolm, we got a snapshot of what he wanted us to see as he was building a foundation for his movement, right, and for his work, in less than a year, right, before he died. When you start to put all of those pieces together, what you see is a Black Muslim who is committed to being self-determined, to saying, okay, I don't have to rely on the American government. I can have friends from outside of this country, and I don't have to align perfectly with their political agenda. I have my own agenda for my own people. And when we, our elders in the Muslim community in New York, in Detroit, in Chicago, all around the country, whether it's the Darul Islam movement, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, the Islamic Party of North America, and on and on and on. These folks, they engaged Muslim, countries and discourses and institutions, but they still thought for themselves.
That's right.
Part of what happens in this movement that you so correctly point out to in the late 70s and in the 80s, and then really it takes off in the 90s, is that you have a generation of young African-American Muslim men, right? Young African-American Muslim men who have all the trauma and all the baggage that a lot of us got, that are suddenly disconnected from their elders. They're disconnected from this older generation of Black Muslims in these communities that maybe could have helped them navigate things. And they go to Saudi Arabia, particularly Saudi Arabia, right? And they get taught a certain iteration of Islam. They're very young. They're impressionable in certain ways. They and the exceptions to this tend to be those who stayed connected to that generation before them. I lived in Philly for about 6-7 years while I was doing my PhD, and I used to attend Masjid Quba, right? The imams are Imam Anwar Muhammad, Imam Anas Muhammad. May Allah preserve them, right? They studied in Saudi Arabia, University of Medina. And I asked Imam Anwar, I said, well, how did you not pick up some of the baggage? I don't want to put words in his mouth and speak for him, but how did you not pick up some of those things that I personally think are less than positive for our people while you were studying there? And one of the things he told me, he said, I always heard my father's voice in my ear saying that you're not over here to pick all that stuff up.
That's right.
So, and I think that to go back to like our initial question, I think that's one of the reasons why, we're losing a lot of the cachet that we have in our communities, because this generation of Muslims who went and got sort of reprogrammed as far as what the priorities of Islam in America should be for our people, they've now sort of, and it's not to vilify, folks, because some of those people were well-intentioned and did some good work, right? But with that expression of Islam came a lot of baggage that made Islam less legible, less comfortable, and less relevant for our people. I remember hearing a story, and I don't want to put people on blast, right? I remember hearing a story about a popular hip hop artist, right, who's known for being, super down for the cause, pro-Black, socialist, all of that, right? And a mutual friend of ours told me that he shared with him a story that when he was a young man and he was about 14 years old, he read the autobiography of Malcolm X and said, I'm loving this. I went to the masjid, took shahada, I want to be a Muslim. But then as he started attending the mosque, the sermons weren't speaking to his condition as a Black man in America. And it wasn't speaking to that sort of radical social justice agenda of Malcolm that he fell in love with. It was speaking to something, based in the Gulf, right? That was conservative, that wasn't speaking his experience. And so ultimately he essentially left Islam. I think he still has a sort of positive, or general orientation to Islam. May Allah help him and guide him, But I think a lot of our people, a lot of our brothers and sisters have had a similar experience.
Yeah, that's true. And that was one of the geniuses of our elder generation, including people like Malcolm. Those were Black internationalists, and they could talk about issues abroad going on in Africa or in certain countries, but they could always tie it back to what was going on here.
Right.
They were connecting the dots. So, like, I'm gonna tell you, like, this showing my age, right? But like, I had a Techniques turntable, and one of my dudes, he was 5%, but he's from the Bronx. But he gave me a copy to hold on to. It was the 12-inch of Malcolm. You know, the one where he had is in black and white, and he has the goatee. On one side, it has Message to the Grassroots.
Yep.
The other side was the Ballad
of the Bullet.
And as a teenager, like that, so I learned about Patrice Lumumba and Jomo Kenyatta and the Mau Mau. But how he talked about Lumumba and Kenyatta over in Central Africa and East Africa, he made it relevant to a type of struggle and a type of like how to organize here, right? And then basically it's the same type of oppressive system by people who control it, who look the same, right? So he was able to connect those dots. Whereas what I've seen is that some people who went and studied, who didn't stay plugged into their mentors, they became more Yemeni than the Yemenis themselves, or they became more Turkish than the Turkish themselves, or they became more Pakistani than the Pakistanis themselves, right? In their sensibilities, right? And you know, so that's something that we also have to interrogate.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Waring and I have been talking about this, about something he's setting up. I can't talk about it right now publicly. That'd be a launch for later about something we're discussing, as well as Ustad Aisha Prime. But when people go off to study overseas, there has to be some sort of orientation they go through here beforehand and consistent. But we have to invest that if people are going to go overseas to study Islam, we have to have a mentor that's over there that can look after them and can basically help keep them grounded to say, like, look, Negro, you still black. You're not Syrian. You know, you still or whatever. You know, you still have this experience, and you know, don't forget that bean pie you grew up eating.
That's
and
right.
Stuff like
that's
that, right. So I mean, that's what we need.
So would you saying that I have to, when you say that, I have to give a shout out to Medina Bai, the Tijani community, because this I find to be one, I'm not going to say it's the only one, because maybe there's others that I'm not as familiar with, but this is a glowing example of what you just described. It actually happened, right? Where you had a West African Muslim scholar, Sheikh Hassan Sisi, who came to America in the 70s and attracted to himself a cadre of African American Orthodox Muslims who were grounded, who knew their religion to an impressive degree for the 1970s, for sure, had an impressive degree of what we now would refer to as sort of religious literacy, right? And I don't just mean being able to read and write. I mean, they understood the Islamic tradition in a way that was unique for the time, who also understood that they felt very grounded in their experience as Black people in America. They didn't want to lose it. They didn't want to leave it. They didn't want to apologize for it. And so connecting with a West African scholar resonated with them. And Sheikh Hassan just happened to be not only a West African scholar, but a West African scholar who vibed with that African American experience, who could understand, would have conversations with his American students about John Coltrane and James Brown, Bob Marley, and just kind of got it right. Was a Pan-African, who had a particular love for people of African descent in the West and knew our history, right? And so, and I have to mention, I mentioned Imam Saeed, who was the father of our brother Dooley. Allah be pleased with both of them. I also have to mention a sister. I mean, I don't want to open up the can of mentioning all the pioneers from that community because it's a lot of them, and I like
Allah be pleased with him.
Ameen. But one sister I want to mention is a sister named, and I'm glad you mentioned Imam Salim. One sister I want to mention is a sister from New York named Sister Karima.
Yeah.
And the reason I want to mention her in particular is because she's somebody who was integral to the forming of the African American Islamic Institute, which was a school established in Senegal, specifically for African American children to come to Senegal and study. And so here you have a school which is really this joint project, this collaboration between West African Muslim scholars, Sheikh Hassan Sisi and his brothers, Imam Sheikh Tijani Sisi, Sheikh Maya Sisi, and people like Sister Kareem Abdul Kareem and others who, she was part of the initial building of the vision of the school along with Sheikh Hassan, and moved to West Africa, to Senegal, with her daughter and some other young people to be that, motherly presence that could also keep folks grounded. So it wasn't like, okay, just sending your kids over to West Africa and you don't know what's happening and they're being trained to be sort of Senegalese, right? No, it was your auntie is still there. And if you get out of hand, she knows how to speak to you, right? And so now it's become this multi-generational community where you have African-American children fluent in Wolof, right? Senegal is their second home. They live transnationally, but they're still grounded, right? They're still like...
When we were there 4 years ago. Time flies.
Wow, was it 4 years ago?
That was 4 years. It was in Rabiul Awwal 4 years ago when we were there in Medina Bay. And we walked through that school. That was a whole 4 years ago. 4 years ago.
Yeah. And because because you coming from Detroit, I got to shout out my brother Imam Kafani. If you want to look at somebody who is embedded in the West African Islamic tradition, but is still himself unapologetically Black man from the wilderness of the West, a great example you got right there, So, and our brother Dooley was that. Our brother Dooley, may Allah be pleased with him, was very much that through and through. So I say that to say that's one model, and we need more. You need more institutions like that, more projects like that. But in that West African piece is an interesting piece. Because once you talk to Muslims in West Africa, you're talking to Muslims who have a very long history of dealing with Arab chauvinism, anti-Blackness, anti-Africanness, and have managed to navigate all of that to be able to build strong, robust Muslim institutions, Muslim cities, right? Have Arab Muslim kings and heads of state coming to them, asking them for their help in the form of prayer, in the form of advice, right? So if we want to look to a model to help us learn how to be Muslim and be comfortable in our own skin and stick our chest out, that is a connection that we should cultivate.
Brother, even when we were there, I remember clearly, and we're gonna wrap this up in a minute, but I remember clearly that we were up in there having lunch with the Sheikh, that there was some people that came from Mauritania, and there was a Sharif that came from Medina, from Saudi Arabia. They came and sat down at the feet of the Sheikh, because that's their Sheikh. Those Arabs came in there and
if anybody doesn't know, Sharif is a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah, Sharif is the Prophet Muhammad. So for those of you who right now who are Black American, who haven't seen this, the picture, especially some of our negative, perhaps interactions we see with Arabs here, to see the power of a big Black man who's jet black, who looks almost like a king sitting in his chair, and you see these Mauritanians that come from the desert, and they coming down and getting on their knees, sitting at the feet of the Sheikh and kissing his hand.
That's right. Rubbing his feet.
They're literally sitting at his feet. He's sitting in a chair. They're on the ground sitting at his feet. And
brother, first time I went to Senegal, I went with my dad, who helped edited a documentary on slavery in Mauritania in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So my vision of Mauritania is I didn't have the whole Zaytuna kind of experience. Oh, studying Mauritania. What I knew about Mauritania was the last country to abolish slavery, and it was racist as heck, right? And I go to Senegal and I see Mauritanians coming and literally rubbing the feet of this jet black man, Sheikh Hassan Sisi. I looked at my dad, and my dad said, "Yeah, this." So this is something special when it can break that idol of white supremacy or colorism or anti-blackness in the heart of those folks, to where I got to sit and rub this man's feet.
Yep, Mauritanians, Moroccans, Saudis, even in less than a year, even the Imam of Masjid al-Aqsa, Palestinian.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're gonna wrap this up. This has been wonderful. But before we close out, tell us what you're working on right now as far as like book projects or what you're writing, about, so people can be on the lookout for your writing.
Sure. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So right now I'm working on a book. It'll be my first book on the history of Islam in New York City. Right now, the tentative title is Black Muslim Cosmopolitanism, but I'm not married to that. I'm still thinking through it. But, hopefully one of the reasons I'm thinking of that as a title is because part of what I'm interested in is the way that these Black American Orthodox Muslims always engaged in a sort of global community or global history of Islam, but particularly focused on building connections with Muslims and histories of Muslims on the African continent. So I'm looking at, going back to the origins of these communities in the 1930s, people like Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija in Brooklyn, who started, as far as we know, the first Muslim institution, first mosque in New York City. And then looking at, sort of the relationship between Islam and folks. I mean, interesting thing about Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija is this became a hub for the jazz scene in Brooklyn, right? So a lot of the Muslim jazz artists who a lot of folks have kind of presumed, for people who know some of the history, that the vast majority of these Muslims who were engaged, people who engaged in Islam from the jazz community were Ahmadiyya. Some of them were Ahmadiyya, but many of them were actually Sunni Muslims. And in New York, they would attend Sheikh Dawood's mosque. But sort of looking at how these communities developed, how in the 60s and 70s, the changing demographics then leads folks from these communities to start to pioneer methods of dealing with things like police brutality, things like poverty, things like sort of increased Black ghettoization in the inner city, but always with this sort of eye toward connecting to histories of Islam on the African continent, communities of Muslims on the African continent. Always, I really make the argument that the origins of Islam in America in 20th century America are really Black internationalist origins. And then ultimately I explore, sort of the turn to African Sufi orders and Sufi networks in Senegal and Sudan. So that's what I'm working on now.
Malcolm had a Sudanese sheikh, a spiritual guide.
That's right. That's right.
Sheikh Abdul Rashid spent time in Sudan.
Yep, Sheikh Abdul Rashid. Shout out to Sheikh Abdul Rashid.
Yeah, we had to get Sheikh Abdul Rashid on and chop it up with him too.
That'll be epic. That'll be epic. I'll be tuning in. And I also mentioned that I recently had a publication, a chapter in a book called Varieties of American Sufism. It was one of the first things that I published in a sort of scholarly edition that recently came out. So that's out there. It's the title of the chapter is When the Divine Flood Reached New York. And other than that, you can check out a lot of my writings on Sapelo Square, which is a website you should check out. Don't just check out my writings, check out a lot of the stuff that's up there. It's an amazing site that was started by a sister named Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, who is another, she'd be somebody to consider having too. Her work on sort of Islam and Black culture, Black youth culture, Black organizing, in sort of organizing spaces, Muslim organizing spaces, excuse me. I think is really groundbreaking. So that's where you can check out some of my stuff.
Wonderful. So look out for Dr. Rasul Miller's book, God willing, talking about Islam in New York. He's not sold in the title yet, but we'll have to bring you back on, inshallah, and try to have a discussion about that book and really have you enlighten us on a lot of that history, a lot of your findings, which I'm sure I probably don't even know probably 5% of even what's in that book. So we're gonna look out for that, and also check out Dr. Miller's writings on Sapelo Square. And with that, we will conclude with this episode of Resurrection Podcast. And may the creator and the owner of peace protect you all and grant all of us peace. Assalamu alaikum.
Ameen. Walaikum salam. Thank you so much, Brother Dawud.